Thanks for joining us tonight. Voters approved 2 state constitutional amendments in Tuesday's spring election.
Both add new rules for officials who administer elections across the state. The First Amendment makes it illegal to use private donations or grants to conduct any primary, election, or referendum. The other says only election officials who are designated by law can perform tasks related to elections. So what does this mean? Brittany Schmidt investigates the implications in our Your Voice, Your Vote report.
During the pandemic of 2020, more than 200 municipalities received grant money from a nonprofit called the Center for Tech and Civic Life to help with the cost of administering 3 federal elections. The city of Green Bay received $1.6 million. About $370,000 of that was sent back.
We used for poll workers, we used for equipment, we used for renting space, all the things that we needed to do in order to run an election in a pandemic.
A second round of grant money from CTCL went towards storage and office upgrades. Green Bay City Council reviewed the allocation of money and approved it.
I believe both of those payments were approved unanimously.
There have been accusations about the money, specifically who provided it and how it was spent. In particular, Republicans in the legislature opposed money donated to the nonprofit by Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg.
Even though it was private money, it was publicly discussed, publicly noticed, publicly documented, just like any private money we get. Right.
Green Bay Clerk Celestine Jeffries says private money is often used in public government, like the city's Parks Department. The Friends of Bay Beach, for example, raise and donate money to help with operations of the amusement park. Now, without the support of private money, municipalities will have to rely mostly on taxpayers. Equipment upgrades, supply needs, and other necessities will have to be in the budget every year.
We will go forward with proper funding of elections that is neither choking the taxpayers nor being too stingy to the election process so that we can't actually run an election.
The effect of the other amendment to pass is not as clear.
I'm not sure what that second constitutional amendment means.
In an interview before the election, the amendment's author, State Senator Eric Wimberger, says volunteers should still be able to help with elections.
Well, I think all they have to do is make them election officials. So they just have to be, I guess the idea would be that it wouldn't be a private organization.
But Michael Haas, Madison's city attorney and former counsel for the Wisconsin Elections Commission, says there's a lot of people involved in administering elections that aren't elected officials, like vendors. Could be a print shop that prints ballots, a mailing house, a trucking company to transport voting equipment.
How is it possible to comply with this constitutional provision and still conduct an election? Do they have to be residents of the county? Do we have to bring all those things in-house to be completed by the clerk staff?
Wimberger says the amendment couldn't be, quote, too specific in its language.
There's a whole lot of intent implied in all of this. And while I'm not always happy with language that can have semantic overload, I guess you could say, it's necessary in certain circumstances.
It's now up to the Wisconsin Elections Commission to provide clarity, something Jeffries hopes to get in the next few months.
So we know exactly what we need to do. And honestly, Brittany, I will do what I need to do in order to run an election that is informative and organized and calm and predictable for our voters.
In Green Bay, Brittany Schmidt, Action 2 News.